Hi, Marco. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm not too sure where to begin. There's so much going on in the world, but why don't we just start with your interpretation of the global economy and where you see the biggest threat and the biggest risks in the coming year?
Well, first of all, thanks for speaking with me, Jimmy. I really appreciate it. I started off the year. Actually, I ended 2024 by obviously producing an annual forecast, as everybody else does, and I highlighted that the biggest risk to the U.S. economy and, by extension, the global economy, because the U.S. consumer has clearly been the global growth engine, and I identified a pretty significant bond market sell-off as the number one risk. And December, which is usually a pretty good month for equities, obviously, and especially, there's the Santa rally, there's the election relief rally. We didn't get the usual combination of those two things. December was a pretty poor month because, as expected, yields did rise. I've called President Trump a human steepener. I think his policies, there's a lot of good stuff. We can talk about all the good stuff that he's bringing to the table, but the bad stuff is that the U.S. economy doesn't need any more growth. It just doesn't. It's got wallops of growth. And so all of the sort of tax cutting, deficit inducing policies to me were the biggest risk. They would have raised yields to a level where consumers and corporates can't really deal with that. And then boom, we get a recession. So that was my biggest risk. It's still a biggest risk. You can still have President Trump demand that Congress pass the things that he's promised. But I think that we've actually avoided that, largely because the fiscal conservatives in the House of Representatives have revolted against President Trump. And I would argue, Jimmy, this is the most underreported macro story in the world because we're all obsessing about tariffs, we're obsessing about AI story, and what we're missing is a pretty fiscally conservative turn. I don't think President Trump's going to fight that. Why would he? What's the upside? And so I think that we've kind of dodged this bullet. And if yields remain somewhere between 3.5% and like 4.5%, I think we're going to be fine. And I think it's going to allow the US economy to shift from a cash driven economy, a stimulus driven economy, a let me spend all my savings and wages economy, to one more propped up by leverage, not insane leverage, but relatively, modest and smart people investing in homes and starting to buy durable goods. So that's something that I'm excited about. But the conviction is low because of all the other things you're going to ask me about, such as trade and so on.
And so I just want to get a better understanding of what your concern is for the US. So currently, the debt levels in the US stand at $35 trillion or 36 trillion. It's increasing by $1 trillion every 100 days. The interest expense is over $1 trillion a year now. That's the single largest line on the budget. And then, of course, we also have issues with immigration and so many other issues. Is it because of the high debt levels and also the large deficit levels that is concerning you about the US economy?
Well, you point out a lot of really important things. So yes, I think there's a pie chart of reasons. Nothing is ever just one thing in macro. And I think when it comes to the US debt levels and yields, I think it's a pie chart of reasons why I'm concerned. One of those slices is the fact that, as you point out, the US spends about 13.5% of all the money it receives through taxes. It spends 13.5% of all revenue collected on financing its debt. That's actually 3 times higher than France. So, over the summer when people kind of lost their mind about French politics, it's like France doesn't have a deficit problem. Like, relax, US does. So that's one slice, though. I don't think it's at a point where it's, existential. I don't. But I do think there's another slice. And the other slice is that even more growth is not necessarily a good thing. And yes, I do understand that that would accelerate the GDP, the denominator, and you might be able to whittle down debt levels. The problem with higher R star and higher neutral rate of growth is that it will pull the 10-year yield higher for sort of non-pernicious, sanguine reasons. Oh my goodness, there's more growth. The problem is that I'm not sure that the corporate sector, which is highly leveraged in the US already and has to refinance a lot of their debts in 2025, 2026. We're talking about small and medium enterprises that hire workers, that do CapEx. I'm not sure that they can withstand those higher rates no matter where growth is. because so much of their debt is already at much lower levels of yield, so the refinancing will cost a lot. And then the second issue is consumers. Consumers have kept their savings rate really low. That's what's powered this last 5 years of high nominal GDP growth. And I think that what we need in the economy is a healthy transition towards a little bit more leverage. You need some millennials who are, by the way, old now. I'm a millennial. I'm going to be 43. You need some of these people to start buying durable goods and homes. And you're not going to do that with mortgage rates above 6%. So it's a combination of factors. I don't want to be nailed down as somebody who's alarmist on debt levels. I am, it's not 10 out of 10 on my alarm level. I think I'm somewhere like 6 or 7 out of 10. But it's other things too. It's even just more growth would have impaired growth. That's the irony of it. And that's why, if you think about it, what I'm saying is not, crazy. Last year, the narrative was you should be long equities because of soft landing. But let's unpack that, Jimmy. Why would you be bullish because the economy is slowing down? Well, because borrowing rates come down and it allows you to sustain the cycle longer at lower levels of growth, which is not a bad thing. And so that's kind of what world I would want to see in 2025. Less growth, lower borrowing costs, allowing us to transition smoothly into a little bit more leverage-driven growth level in the US. And I think that will happen if President Trump listens to members of his own party who have turned pretty concerned about debt levels and bond yields.
So you raise a good point, because just to provide some more context for our viewers, the Republicans have a majority in both the House and the Senate, but that majority in the House is razor thin. They've had a number of resignations. Do you think, and because of these fiscal conservatives, do you think the Trump is going to be able to get anything done?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, was very clear during his confirmation hearing. But notice that he was very clear about only one thing and one thing only, which is tax cuts. So the only thing that Secretary Bessent defended in front of the Senate during his confirmation hearing was that 2017 tax cuts have to be extended. And it was very interesting to me that he used really the narrative of the fiscal cliff to defend it. And this fiscal cliff basically means suddenly the legislation changes because tax cuts expire, and boom, you have this huge headwind to growth from higher taxes. And so he didn't really defend it from a perspective of like, hey, we need lower taxes because job creators need to pay less tax. It was more just like, hey, let's not have a fiscal cliff. I mean, who would want one, right? So I think that was important, Jimmy, because it's member of the White House. It's not member of Congress, and the White House seems to be on board with merely passing the tax cuts. There was no conversation about Social Security tax cuts that President Trump brought up in his campaign, taxes on tips, which isn't that much. I mean, they could maybe roll that in, but none of that other stuff came up during the confirmation hearing, and that's on purpose. I think the big news item that nobody paid attention to was really in December. You had a newly elected president with an incredible democratic mandate that nobody expected, right? President Trump comes with a lot of momentum, and he and Elon Musk asked for the debt ceiling to be pushed off to 2029 so that President Trump wouldn't have to deal with this constantly. And the House Republicans refused to follow with that plan. And I think that was extraordinary. I don't remember the last time I saw an incoming president have a revolt from his own party that quickly into his presidency. I mean, the Republicans in the House basically told President Trump, no, you're going to have to deal with the same cumbersome debt ceiling that Joe Biden had to deal with, that Barack Obama had to deal with. Sorry, we're not going to give this to you. And I think that a lot of investors missed that. I had a view that the 10-year yield would have to be a constraint, that it would go above 5%, that we would have agita in the equity market as a result. That was my view in December. And then when I saw that revolt, I said, maybe the House Republicans took the message from that extraordinary sell-off in the bond market following 100 basis points worth of cuts by the Fed. And I think they did.
That's an interesting point. So why don't we just talk about interest rates now? And when we look at the 10-year, that yield has been very volatile. It's gone from a low of, I think, 380 up to as high as 470. Now it's around 450. Do you think the Fed has lost control of the long end of the curve? I mean, they're able to control the short end, no problem. But do you think the bond market is saying, you know what, we're concerned about the debt, we're concerned about the deficits?
Absolutely. I mean, they did lose control. Like there's no question about it. This is a mathematical certainty. In fact, the sell-off, like the human steepener narrative, that Donald Trump is a human steepener, it was absolutely mathematically correct. The 10-year yield went up 100 basis points, a little bit more, from end of September when the market started realizing that Vice President Harris was actually a pretty poor candidate relative to Trump. And this was also the moment when the Fed cut rates by 100 basis points. So this kind of disconnect between the short end and the long end is usually something that happens in emerging markets in Brazil. And there was a moment when Scott Bessent got nominated as the Treasury Secretary over Howard Lutnick, which was worth about 50 basis points, of a rally in the yields. And I remember speaking to a fixed income client in New York City, and he said something to me. An older gentleman said, Marco, I don't remember the last time the appointment of an American Treasury Secretary mattered. And I said, yeah, no, I know. Like it kind of feels like when Brazil chooses the right finance minister and the real rallies just on those news. And so we have entered that realm. We've entered that realm of emerging market like bond market moves where you need to be reading thehill.com rather than Bloomberg or Financial Times. Like literally logging into thehill.com is more valuable as a fixed income trader than anything else. And I don't think that's a good thing. So yes, I do think the Fed has lost control of the curve. And I think that what's going to matter over the next 12 to 18 months are the words that come out of Scott Bessent's mouth and the laws that come out of Congress. Those matter far more than anything the Fed does.
And do you see a threat of interest rates? Let's just say the 10-year yield is at 450. Do you see it going to 5 or 550?
Well, yes, I do if President Trump doesn't heed the story I just gave you and says, you know what, Mark was wrong. I haven't given up on all my priorities. I promised my voters Social Security, tax cuts. I promised them taxes and tips. I promised them even bigger corporate tax cuts. So let's go. And I don't care what some fiscal conservative from Arkansas thinks. So if that's the case, then obviously I'll be wrong. The 10-year yield will go back up. And I was in that camp, just to be clear, Jimmy, I was in that camp like 3 months ago. I was in the camp that the bond market would need to riot further in order to constrain policymakers. But what I've seen is members of Congress like Andy Barr from, I think, Kentucky say things publicly. He's saying things like, well, we shouldn't present conservative policies as austerity. We should present them as a way to keep your mortgage rate low to our voters. And he's referring obviously to the 10-year yield. So I think that members of Congress have become far more sensitive to borrowing rates than I expected. And so I think it's going to be a challenge for President Trump to bulldoze them. And by the way, he can't. I think too many people have become enamored with the idea of a presidential political system. Presidential political system is not one that actually delivers reforms or policies. It's actually parliamentary systems that are far easier to push through policies because you have no checks and balances if you have a majority in the parliament. President Trump does have checks and balances. And on anything that has to do with revenue or deficits, it's Congress that will ultimately decide. And as I've articulated already, I mean, it's been 3 months and fiscal conservatives are definitely back in force, which I think a lot of investors doubt because we have had 7, 8 years of just profligate fiscal policy from both parties, from both parties. And so we've forgotten what it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like when Congress says no.
Yeah, that would be good to see because when Trump first came to power in 2016, the debt level was 16 trillion. Now we're at 36 trillion. It's just crazy what's happened here in those
That's
last
an
few
important point,
years.
Jimmy. Like just to follow on that, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. I think a lot of investors, and that's fine. People have their ideological bent. I don't. I'm bathed in aloof indifference in order to do my job. But I can tell you, it's an empirical fact. It was President Trump that broke orthodoxy first. It was he was the first president who presided over a pro-cyclical fiscal stimulus since the 1960s. So it was the first time that unemployment rate in the United States of America was going down while deficits were increasing. And then after the pandemic, I joke, but it was the Trump Pelosi administration. That's what I call it. They were best friends. It was like a comedy show. Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi together. And they basically surged fiscal spending. They were trying to fall over each other who was going to propose more stimulus during the pandemic at a level that no other country did. And a lot of Americans ignore this because they don't focus on the rest of the world. But if you look at fiscal spending as percent of GDP, nobody did nearly as much as the United States. And so that was bipartisan. And then, of course, when Joe Biden came to power, he couldn't stop himself. He was just like one year after another, more and more spending. So anybody who comes in and says that this is political or partisan just misses the picture. This was universal, bipartisan consensus on unorthodox fiscal policy, and it's coming to an end. And I don't think investors are ready for it. They haven't wrapped their minds around this because they've been too lazy in a way, and they've been politically extrapolating linearly the consensus and the paradigm we've lived in for the past 7 years.
So the fiscal spending is coming to an end. We're going to see a massive decrease in the trillions of dollars that have been spent. What does this do to the economy? Do we see a massive slowdown this year, and does it go into a recession?
So, great question. First of all, let's just be very clear what is happening. We're not going to have austerity. So when we think about the deficits level, I actually don't think deficits are going to come down. We're not yet. I think we need another bout of inflation. We need another crisis before we get back to sort of the painful medicine. So I wouldn't describe the next 12 to 18 months as taking painful medicine. I would describe it more as a heroin addict coming off of heroin, which in of itself can be painful. But you shouldn't expect deficits to come down. They're still going to pass the $4 trillion extension of the 2017 tax cuts. They have to, but they will pay for much of it. So a lot of your viewers might be listening to this and being like, well, so nothing really changes. No. It actually does change because the way the government impacts growth is not through just wanton deficit spending. It's the cyclically adjusted change in the primary balance sheet, which is what we call fiscal thrust. It's the change in the deficit that gives you the G in the GDP equation, effectively. And so my point is that the US government, the G will no longer be a tailwind. It's not going to be a headwind. It's just not going to be there. Now, you might say, well, wow, it's been 25 minutes we've been talking. This is a pretty modest view. Like, gee, there's no headwind. There's just a little less tailwind. Well, no, it's actually pretty profound because I believe, Jimmy, and this is controversial, and I'm probably the only person on this corner, but I believe that a lot of the reasons that we look at the US economic and asset performance over the last 5 years, and we were in awe of it, a lot of it has to do with this wanton fiscal spending. That was just a constant, persistent, positive fiscal thrust. So there's many people who show charts of American productivity relative to the rest of the world, and they're in awe of just how much more productive America has been. And I would argue balderdash. No, it hasn't been. It's all malarkey. Productivity is merely output per hour worked. And if I showed up at your house, Jimmy, with a wheelbarrow of money and I dumped it on your head, and the next day you bought Porsche Panamera, all your neighbors would be like, wow, Jimmy's been productive. Nope. Marko just showed up and dumped a wheelbarrow of cash on his head. And so when you look at productivity data and you compare US versus the rest of the world, how do you know it's about AI or it's about American entrepreneurship or it's about America being a better country to start a business and all this other kind of narrative nonsense we tell ourselves? This is a land of unicorns and gumdrops. Or maybe it's simply because the US has spent 4 times more than Europe did over the last 5 years in fiscal spending. So this is really important stuff. And the reason it's important is not because there's going to be a recession or a slowdown is going to be bad. It's because all of the expectations of US growth outperforming the rest of the world are going to have to be adjusted. Not massively. I'm not saying the rest of the world is going to start outperforming the US, but currently US assets, including the US dollar, are priced for perfection. The rest of the world is priced for imperfection. And so the narrowing of these two levels is going to, I think, end the secular bull market in everything American. And that's why I think the big macro call of 2025 is that when investors realize that the fiscal gravy train in the US is coming to an end, I think the dollar will peak no matter what happens with tariffs.
I hope you're right about the dollar because it's killing me. This Canadian dollar, I think it was down 10% last year. It's at a
Yeah,
22-year low against the
22-year
US.
low. Well, so that's one of my favorite currencies, to be honest with you, Jimmy. Like, I think the Canadian dollar has massive amount of upside. You have an election in Canada that will bring in a pro-growth, pro-business government that will have a majority. So this nonsense that the U.S. political system is better for change, I mean, it's hilarious. We've had 3 weeks of Donald Trump, and people suddenly think presidential systems are faster. They're not. They're slower. He has to deal with Congress. The next Prime Minister of Canada, which clearly will be Poilievre, they're not going to have to deal with Congress. Their power comes from Congress. They're an elected dictator. That's what parliamentary systems create, which is good in one way. Of course, if they do bad things, then that's bad too. But those 4 years, if the Conservative Party in Canada has a majority, and this is not an endorsement of their like whatever policies, I'm just saying if you have 4 years majority, you can do whatever you want like that, much faster than the US president. So that's one reason to be bullish in Canada. I'm also a commodity bull, not like crazy, but like enough to be bullish on some of the things that Canada does well. And then finally, just the currency is so cheap that there will be competitiveness advantages. And then finally, yes, also I think tariffs and US-Canada relationship are going to stabilize over the next 12 months.
Yeah, I hope you're right in all that. And one thing, just for the viewers, Canada is rich in resources. It's got some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, potash, uranium, just so many more things that everyone needs. We just need a government that's going to do a better job of, I guess, marketing these products to the world.
Well, I think one of the biggest own goals of the Trump administration, and there will be many, just like with any other president. So I'm not necessarily criticizing Trump for being specifically poor, but a big own goal is anchoring Canada or waking it up. And the reason I say that is because America has a really sweet deal. Canada has no alternative ways to ship its resources to the rest of the world. And obviously, by threatening Canada's exports with higher tariffs, President Trump has lit the largest bonfire under Canadian politicians' rear ends. And they are now focused singularly on like, oh yeah, maybe we should have built the Energy East corridor through Montreal and the St. Lawrence Seaway, or the infrastructure via British Columbia to export to the Pacific and Atlantic basins. And I think that that's going to happen over the next 4 years. Quite frankly, the Green Party of Canada could win the next election. And we're going to see Canada build the kind of infrastructure that really is to the detriment of the US. Now, maybe Americans can like bomb them, like maybe that could happen, but I don't see that happening. I mean, this is the problem of sort of conducting foreign policy as if it's a game of Civilization 4, which might fly over some of your watchers' head, but this isn't a computer game, where you're trying to acquire resources on a map. It's still like the real world, and the deal that America has with Canada is just so beneficial to the US that I think the awakening in Canada will only benefit the country going forward.
When you look at the Canadian economy, a lot of people might not know this, but in spite of the fact that our largest trading partner is the US, and the US has been doing very well economically speaking in the last few years, the Canadian economy is not. A lot of that has to do with the immigration policy that has been put forth by the Liberal government. But Canada's GDP on a per capita basis and both on a nominal basis have been declining now for many quarters. Productivity levels have been in a decline for many years now. And once again, it all has to do with the policies put forth by the current government have been more focused on social issues as opposed to economic issues, and as a result, the country is suffering. So, a new government and a change of course is welcomed by many Canadians.
And it usually happens. I mean, first of all, the popularity of Prime Minister Trudeau is very low. So this is a universal view. I think one way to think about it too is, how I talked about the advantages of the parliamentary system. You can really do a lot if you have a majority. However, one of the disadvantages is that I have noticed, and this is anecdotal, this isn't empirical, so I just want to make that clear, but I've noticed in my experience that when really smart, really effective, really well articulated, well meaning policymakers stay in power for over 8 years in a parliamentary system, it does get to their head. We've seen that with Angela Merkel, with Gerhard Schroeder, with Tony Blair, even the Chrétien government in Canada. Like, eventually, it always almost ends poorly for anyone who's stayed that long. And one of the reasons is that they don't have checks and balances. And so often what happens with even a really well-run reformist government like Margaret Thatcher as the ultimate example of somebody who did a lot of good in the United Kingdom, at the end, it always ends in ignominy and failure. And I think the reason is the lack of checks and balances. I think people in power, it gets to them, and then they start focusing on sort of hero projects instead of just maintaining what they did well. So I think that that's just a natural evolution. It's not about liberals versus conservatives in Canada or anything like that. It's more eventually, over 8 years, you're in overtime. It's very difficult to remain effective at that length in a parliamentary system.
No, great points. And one of the things that I have found so shocking in the last few years with this Liberal government is that they don't know how to read the room. And I think it just goes back to what you said. It's just a level of arrogance, and they're above everybody else, and they don't know how the common man and woman is feeling right now. And we've had very high inflation rates here in Canada in the last few years. Taxes were continuously being taxed on after-tax dollars. The Liberal government implemented two new taxes here in the last couple of years. It's carbon tax that continues to go up, and also a capital gains tax. And the very fact that you would do that during a very tough economic time tells me they're not reading their room, and they really don't have a good sense of what's happening within the Canadian economy.
You know, you rely on consultants who tell you what you want. Again, the feedback mechanism isn't there because of the parliamentary system, which is, again, an advantage when you want to get stuff done. But reading the room, you're right, that is a problem. The immigration one is very interesting. I mean, I like to, speak in facts. And the fact is that Canadians have soured on immigration. I mean, this is clearly shown in the polls. Canada has one of the largest populations of immigrant origin in the OECD. I think Switzerland is higher, but that's already very high. So that's very interesting because it means that many first-time immigrants, like first-generation immigrants in Canada, have soured on immigration. And you need to really fumble something poorly to get immigrants to don't like immigration anymore. And that's what's happened. And it's not because Canadians are anti-immigrant. It's because the surge in immigration occurred, obviously, and this is for those of your viewers who are not, Canadian based, because everybody in Canada already knows this. But the surge in immigration was not complemented with infrastructure building, and you're not going to have infrastructure built if you don't deregulate, if you don't make it easier to construct, to build, to destroy, to tear down, to rebuild. And I think that's a good example of, I think, the process you're talking about. But it's okay. One thing I will say is that, again, it's not about left or right wing. It's not about liberals being incompetent or conservatives. Everybody ultimately comes to the natural end of their time in power. And that's why we have a democratic system. I think democracies are superior because it allows a reset. And Canada's about to have a reset. Another country that I'm very optimistic about, even though nobody is Germany. Very similar situation to Canada in that the center left has been in power for a very long time. And the coalitions cobbled together to keep them in power became increasingly more unnatural. Again, very similar to the story in Canada. And so, the center-right party is going to come back, very similar to the conservatives in Canada. The CDU in Germany have basically they've refreshed their perspective, so it's not the old CDU of Angela Merkel. Friedrich Merz is a very different chancellor with a very different ideology, and the core underpinnings of the new government in Germany will be pro-business. Friedrich Merz published a book, as many have already they know because the media reports it. I think it is important to repeat. The title of the book was More Capitalism. That was the title, More Capitalism. And I think depending on the kind of a coalition that's cobbled in Germany, you should expect pretty dramatic structural reforms there as well.
One of the things that I thought you said was interesting was the fact how Canadians have kind of got mobilized here because of this potential trade war with the US. And it's interesting in the last 5 years, we've seen this, especially since Russia invaded Ukraine, but we've become aware of how we're all relying on other countries. So the US, they're very reliant on China for lithium ion batteries. Okay. If you're an EV maker, you got to go to China to get your batteries. If you need lithium, you got to go to Chile, which is the world's largest lithium producer. In Canada, we're relying on the US for most of our trade. We're an export-driven country. I think 30% of our GDP comes from exporting, and of that, 22% comes from the US. And now we've kind of waken up to the fact, oh my God, we've put all our eggs in one basket. And we didn't do that deal with Germany. We didn't do that deal with other European countries where we can sell them our oil and LNG. And so hopefully this is going to change things. Unfortunately, it's probably going to take 10 years, right,
Yes.
for meaningful change to happen. But I want to ask you now, I want to move outside of North America. You touched on Germany, but I want to ask you about Russia and Ukraine. This war has been going on for 3 years now. I can't believe it. But I was always under the impression that Russia had this military force, but they're not even in Kiev yet. What's your sense of what's happening there? And is Russia a weaker military force than we thought it was?
Absolutely. Of course it is. But there's a couple of things going on. I mean, we knew that in April of 2022. I remember when that 40-kilometer convoy was outside of Kiev, and a lot of the media was presenting it as some sort of a show of awesome power. Like their mechanized column is 40 kilometers long. And I just immediately said, I mean, I live in Los Angeles, so I've seen these before. It's called a traffic jam, and it's not a sign of power. It's a sign of incompetence. And it's a sign of just, like poor thinking, poor planning. But there's a couple of things going on here that, aside from incompetence, because incompetence can be fixed. President Putin can, take the licks of the last 3 years and get better at things. That's one of the things that he could take from this. And so you can still be bearish about the future of Europe because of a narrative that, well, Russians will learn. They're very smart people. They can figure out how to not be bad at war. Except that there's several things that are much more secular and structural. First and foremost, defensive military technology. Let me say it again, defensive military technology has run ahead of offensive. And this is something that actually happened in the late 19th or early 20th century, which is why European policymakers rushed into First World War with glee, thinking that it would be over by Christmas. I mean, that was literally the term they used, but it wasn't. And it was largely because of the machine gun and artillery. And so it became very difficult to conduct war in sort of in those cavalry charges. They became useless. And so we got bogged down in a 4-year long trench warfare. Similarly, today, the use of man-portable anti-tank weaponry like javelins, which are very cheap relative to the cost of a tank, things like drones, things like artillery, they become very good. Also, air defense systems, which basically neutralize Russia's awesome advantage in terms of their air assets. They should be dominating the airspace over Ukraine, and they're not because of the threat to their aircraft. And obviously, main battle tanks, which Russia has a huge advantage in, they've been neutralized by the javelins, and then drones have neutralized a lot as well. So that's the first thing that I would point out. And what's interesting about that is that it works both ways. So remember when the media got very enthusiastic about a Ukrainian offensive? Well, if the Russians can't sustain an offensive, of course the Ukrainians can't either. It's not like the Russians don't have their own version of the Javelin. They do. It's not like they don't have drones. Of course they do. So both sides have really struggled in terms of offense. The second issue is Russia doesn't have the political consensus to digest all of Ukraine. It's quite frankly a ludicrous like notion that Russia can digest a country that's basically a third of its size. I mean, it's very, very large, and it's full of people who don't like Russia. You can maybe ethnically cleanse a million people from Donetsk or Luhansk. You cannot ethnically cleanse 43 million Ukrainians out of Ukraine. Like that's physically impossible to do. So, this notion that Russia is going to invade all of Ukraine and conquer it, it's like, it's like my Labrador catching up with a car. What are you going to do once you do? Like you're going to enslave 40 million Ukrainians? They don't have the troops for that. They don't have the resources for that. And so you've noticed that because there is actual political resistance in Russia for a full out conflict with Ukraine. How many mobilizations have President Putin done? How many has he done? He's done one. In September of 2022, it was politically costly, which is why he's been using convicts, North Koreans, and various ethnic groups in Russia, and just basically paying people massive amount of money to go to fight in Ukraine. That's unsustainable. And I think that President Putin, more than anyone else, is happy that Trump is going to give him sort of an exit out of this conflict. Now, that said, there is one wrinkle in this story. I'm basically giving you a pretty hopeful view that both sides are exhausted. They're looking for a ceasefire. They're looking to freeze this conflict. The only problem is that Donbas, which is a region made up of two Ukrainian states or provinces, or as they call them, oblasts, Donetsk and Luhansk. Donbas is pretty important to Russia. It's called Novaya Russia. It's supposed to be like a new part of Russia, just like Crimea. And Russians have failed to conquer that part. So, you're talking about failing to conquer Kiev. Like they haven't even conquered the most pro-Russian, Russian-speaking region of Ukraine. That's how total their failure has been. And so there is still a remaining part of Donetsk that Russians would politically want to have before they can call a ceasefire. So I do think there's a wrinkle in the negotiations. President Trump, he said that he wants a deal on day one. I think Putin would prefer a day like 6-8 months from now, when they can finally grind Ukraine out of Donetsk. There's not a lot left of it, but there's still some of it. And it is a political thorn in Russia's side because it is part of Ukraine that at the very least they feel they should have. So that's kind of something that could drag out the negotiations, but I'm pretty confident we will have a ceasefire. I don't think there'll ever be a peace deal. There'll never be an acceptance of these territorial changes, but it will be a frozen conflict that will last 10, 20, 30, maybe even, 50 years. I mean, look at South Korea and North Korea. They never had a peace deal. It's a frozen conflict, and the two countries are effectively completely sovereign, even though they never signed that deal.
And Russia is the third largest oil producer in the world. And when they did invade Ukraine in 2022, a number of sanctions were placed on them against exporting oil. But as you recently wrote in one of your reports that the U.S. Department of Treasury placed sanctions on 183 Russian ships, many of which are carrying crude. And they've also placed sanctions on other Russian energy assets. What do you think this is going to do to the oil price in the coming months if they do come to some sort of resolution?
Well, I mean, something like that could be taken off. It is going to take some time for a resolution to happen. So I think this is one of those things, one of those situations where I think there's going to be like a curve. First, prices have to go up, not just because of the negotiations themselves. Look, President Trump has never conducted negotiations by being nice. This will be the first time he's opened up with somebody on nice terms. He just doesn't do that. He starts off asking for the moon, then he, actually punches people in the face. And so I do expect sanctions to get tighter on Russia. You also have to, if you're thinking about the geopolitical premium on oil price, you have to also remember that there's another issue going on, which is Iran. So I would expect there to be sanctions placed on Iran, if not even kinetic action. President Trump is known to like to actually bomb things and assassinate people, as he did with General Soleimani. So he will not start negotiations with either Russia or Iran in sort of like from a position of a friendly talk. He will be very aggressive. And so I think that oil prices have to go up in order for them to come down. And so in the near term, which is 3 to 6, maybe longer, we need to kind of travel with events, Jimmy, and see how long this takes. I do think that both in the case of Russia and Iran, there are more opportunities for negotiations to go off track than for them to be resolved quickly. And only then by the end of the year could I see oil prices coming down. And this is why President Trump has said that, the tariff policy, geopolitics, it will all be painful to voters. I hear too many of my clients say, but he promised us lower oil prices, but he promised us low inflation. Well, he did, but not like his promise on all these things doesn't mean he has to execute on it right away. There can be this arc where we do get some inflationary pressures, we do get higher oil prices in the near term, and then by the end of the year, these situations are resolved. And I think both Russia and Iran will ultimately have to cry uncle, as we say, because they have no alternatives. In Russia, it's about domestic stability for the regime. In Iran, it's the same thing. On top of that, Iran has no ability to confront the United States of America in any way, shape, or form. It's like Incas and conquistadores. They have no technological ability to sustain a conflict with the US, particularly with an America that doesn't care what happens to them. You can say whatever you want about Bush's sort of neoconservative foreign policy, but he did care about at least the perception that the US wasn't making Iraq a worse place to live. Americans invaded it. They tried to win hearts and minds. President Trump will openly turn Iran into a parking lot and not have a problem with that. And I think Iranians understand this.
I want to get your views on China now. It's the second largest economy in the world, representing 20% of global GDP. And the relationship between the US and China has been tense, I guess you could say, since Trump's first term, and it continued on into Biden's administration. But do you see this improving at all?
Ironically, I do, Jimmy, and this is where I'm again very alone in this corner. I've got my lawn chair out, some beer in the cooler. Everybody else is on the other corner. And my corner is one where I see that President Trump is the only human being in the United States of America who can make a deal with China. We have a saying in political science, only Nixon could go to China. I don't know if you've heard of that phrase. Why do we have that phrase? Well, we have that phrase because Nixon was an ardent anti-communist. So when he decided to pivot after the Vietnam War and ally with China versus the Soviet Union, the American public believed him. If it had been any other politician, they would have been like, you're being soft on communist China. But not Nixon, who had dedicated his life to being basically as obsessive about fighting communism everywhere as anyone other than Barry Goldwater. So President Trump is in a similar position in which if he makes a deal on China, no one's going to accuse him of being, a CCP spy. I mean, this is the man who has singularly pivoted American focus away from endless wars in the Middle East towards, the threat of China. And he's created a consensus on that. I mean, notice his pivot on TikTok. I mean, no one's accused President Trump of being soft in China. Can you imagine if Joe Biden had done the same thing? He would have, all the Beijing Joe accusations would have obviously surfaced again. So I think that we should be prepared for a pretty surprising outcome in US-China relations. There are rumors out there of the two sides actually looking to create a joint communique on Taiwan, where they would sort of anchor this situation. I mean, that's just a rumor, so let's see where that develops. But even on economy, I think that US has a particular very powerful moment when the US consumer is the most important source of growth in the world. It's using it to its advantage with Canada, with Mexico, with China. And I think that China is going to have to accept that as a reality and act accordingly. Their retaliation to the 10% increase in tariffs was pretty pitiful. And I think that was by design. They don't want to anger President Trump. They want to deal. So I actually think that 12 months from now, we're going to be pretty shocked with what President Trump delivers on the China front.
It's amazing how China has pivoted away from the US in the last 8 years when these trade wars started. Now they got the world's largest trade surplus. It's growing at over $100 billion a month. I believe it's over $1 trillion now, but they don't need the US anymore. They sell a lot of goods to South America. Brazil, for example, they want to buy a $10,000 car. They don't have auto
Yeah.
unions. They're preventing them from importing those cars. But do you think that, like you just said, you think they're going to work out a deal in the next 12 months, but maybe China says, you know what, we don't need you anymore. We're selling to
No,
South America, we're selling to Asia, we're selling to
yeah.
the Middle
No,
East.
listen, this is totally happening. You're absolutely correct. But just one thing that I would note, a lot of this is the final demand is still in the US. So we need to be careful to not like we can extrapolate linearly into the future and say, wow, China's really made inroads in the global south, and it absolutely has. It's wiped the floor with America in the global south, and this is going to hurt America massively if they don't adjust their aggression on trade policy, because they need to curry favor with Brazil's, Indonesia's, Malaysia's, Turkey's. These are very important sources of growth in the future. So I agree with you with what you said, but a lot of Chinese outward FDI has moved, and that's where you see a lot of these exports going to Vietnam or Mexico or Brazil. But the final demand is often in the US. It's re-exporting that they're also doing. So I don't think that it's a binary. I think that China can do both things. It can both plan for the future and continue to have good relationship with the global South. It's something that America has to wake up to. And if you listen to some of the things that Marco Rubio is talking about as the new Secretary of State, it does appear that Americans have woken up to this reality. But I do think Chinese also want to just have that stable source of income from the US, even if it's diminishing. It's just, why would you go to zero so quickly? It's 2025, it's not 2045. Indonesia doesn't have 600 million people yet. I think that China doesn't want that to go to zero. And I think that some of the other things that China is doing suggest that they can kind of both chew gum and walk at the same time. They can try to do both. I think one of the most underreported, underexamined geopolitical events is the China-India border negotiations, which really heated up last year. It seems that India and China are going to resolve that. And I think that that should really worry America. I think Americans have taken India way too much for granted. There's just view like India has to worry about China. No, it doesn't. India's got nuclear weapons. It's got the Himalayas between it and China. Like, China's not going to invade India. Let's relax here. And so, yeah, India does have alternatives to America. And one of those is that if they solve that problem, can you imagine that as an alternative to China in terms of exports, in terms of consumer market? Because who really wants a $10,000 car? Your point about Brazil, it's India. So I think that you're right. China has options. A lot of countries have options, but I don't think that they want to anger the US. It's just not necessary. If they can make small deals with America that placate the US in the short term, it gives them more runway for the long term. And I think that's what they're going to choose. It's kind of both policies at the same time.
And I gotta, before I let you go, I gotta get your thoughts on the Panama Canal and also Greenland. How do you think these issues get resolved?
Well, I think also we should roll into that question, Jimmy. Also, the notion about Canada becoming the 51st state. They're all kind of there's a couple of ways to think about this. I think we as investors have to learn that President Trump will always talk about, again, going for the moon. He will say, "I want to get to the moon," but really he just wants to get to the roof of the house. So and I think one of the things that he's doing is he's putting pressure on countries in North America for more regional integration, which is kind of hilarious and funny because everybody sees Trump as being this anti-globalization guy. But we might wake up in 2026 and see a world of more trade because he's forced everyone else to lower their tariffs. That might be the outcome that nobody expected. But within the region, he wants more actual collaboration between Canada, Mexico, Panama, Greenland, and so on. And so I don't think he's playing Civilization 4 again, Many of your older viewers might not know what I'm talking about. It's a computer game where you start with a settler and you just want to clean everyone off the map and steal their gold mines. I don't think he's doing that. I think that he is thinking more broader. But here's the thing. While I have some level of confidence in his ability to actually kind of poke and get people to wake up and then do a better deal from an American perspective, I do fear that he's opened up a Pandora's box of the way that people, as Americans, approach the rest of the world. Because while I think he has a longer term plan that's actually quite rational, like, hey, let's integrate more. Canada, you don't have the ability to control your borders. Let's be honest. You're 40 million people controlling the largest border in the world. We need to synchronize this. We need to create a North American Schengen. And that's, by the way, Jimmy, where I think we're headed. As an idea, I mean, it's not a bad idea. If France and Germany get to say who comes into Polish borders, US should probably have a say in who comes into Canada. Like on some level, that kind of a loss of sovereignty is not the end of the world for Canada. The problem is that while he may see the big picture that he's hidden away from us, the way that he pursues it, the language he uses is the language of imperialism. And that is something that America's never done. And I often remind my clients, especially Americans who have started to use that language themselves. I mean, I've had a question from several people, very well educated, very prominent investors who have said, why should Canada be independent? Why? The answer that I'll often have is like, you do realize that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was infinitely greater threat to America than China. Like infinitely. They literally had thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at the United States, and we were basically in an open conflict with them. That's not the case with China at all. I mean, you and I are using China-made equipment to do this call, so let's not confuse the world we're in. During the Cold War, America would have been annihilated via Canada. Like this is a fact. Those ICBMs would have come over the North Canadian Shield, and it would have been over. And yet, during this height of risk and threat to the United States, America never contemplated just invading and annexing Canada. It was okay to collaborate with this sovereign country. They gave up its sovereignty. Obviously, there were American military installations across the Canadian North. I mean, these were like NORAD installations. Canada had some claim to this being a dually led program, but not really, let's be honest. And that was enough for Americans. At the height of their existential threat from nuclear annihilation, the American leadership of the 50s and 60s never once really contemplated, like, hey, why should Canada be independent? And so while I do think that President Trump and the people who advise him do have a longer term kind of a plan that's actually pretty beneficial for all countries, I think that the words that he's using are waking up a level of callousness in the American discourse that under some different leader, in some different macro context, could produce a far more pernicious outcome. And that's where I think that the administration should rein that in. And I rarely use the word should, but if the United States of America obviously becomes a country that doesn't care about self-determination of other countries, well then, it's not the United States of America anymore.
Well, a lot of fascinating topics there. So we touched on a lot of things. We touched on the US and Canada and China and Ukraine. If there was one possible event, either political or economic, that we didn't discuss, like a black swan event, which could result in a significant pullback in the US economy and the financial markets, what could it be?
Well, we talked about a lot of things I am worried about, particularly if President Trump were to ignore fiscal conservatives and go after them, yields go up, equities go down. I think one that we didn't talk about is AI. And there's a lot of hope and dreams in the Magnificent Seven. I think a lot of investors are bullish just AI, but they don't know how to articulate that bullishness, so they just buy, Magnificent Seven, many of which have dubious claims to AI leadership, first of all. So I think that the biggest risk to the equity market in the United States, Jimmy, is actually this, that we one day wake up and two things, we realize three things. One, Magnificent Seven companies may not be the companies to invest in if you want to play the AI theme. That's number one. Number two, even worse, the AI theme might actually be bad for enterprise software solutions, which get disrupted by universal adoption of AI that allows you to maybe code your own Microsoft Office. Like, hey, I don't like the way the Excel works. I'm going to do my own. Boom, you get it. And then the third risk is that we're investing in railroads. And so railroads are a really, really scary analogy. Nobody can sit here and say railroads did not change humanity. They did. They were the engine of industrialization. Newspapers at the time in the late 19th century would compare railroad buildouts between countries the way we do, China, US, AI race. Everybody was racing to build more and more miles of railroads. But not a single railroad company survived or was a good investment, partly because it was a general purpose technology that was very, very capital intensive, unlike software. Software is actually not CapEx intensive. As anybody who's done venture knows, you just give some money to a 20-year-old dropout out of Stanford so they can pay for their rent and some weed, and off they go. They produce an app. That's software. AI is capital intensive. You have to actually build the rails. You have to build the actual GPU units. And so the concern here is that we're actually investing in railroad. And if we ever wake up to these three facts, we could have a pretty significant re-rating of American economy. And everything you and I talked about for 60 minutes now will be insignificant. It's not going to be about fiscal policy or trade or geopolitics. It's just going to be all of us waking up one day and saying, like, wait a minute, these are not the companies. These are not the droids you're looking for, to use the Star Wars meme. We've overpriced this, and the re-rating of Magnificent Seven then becomes a macro event in of itself. Just like, obviously the .com crash was. Now, I wouldn't be super bearish. I do think that this would be a buy on dips opportunity. You just will not want to buy back into those companies. You will want to buy back into value sectors of the economy that would then benefit from AI. And so that's where I actually think you will see considerable upside growth. I think it will be the industrials, the materials, the energy, maybe some consumer sectors too that will benefit from AI. It's not going to be tech.
Fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you very much, Marko, for spending time with us today. If somebody would like to follow you online or learn more about your services, where can they go?
Yeah, so if you just want to see my random thoughts, which I fire off quite regularly, I think Twitter is the best to do so. It's at Geo_Papic, GEO_PAPIC, occasionally on LinkedIn as well. But if you're interested in sort of more professional investment research services, BCAResearch.com is the easiest way to do that. So thank you.
And I will include a link in the show notes. Marko, once again, thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. This was awesome.